This video is sponsored by the War Games Research Group. I'm trying to build a complete compendium to teach new players how to play DBMM, so please like the video, comment and subscribe so this series gets shown to more people. This week we'll be covering terrain placement. Terrain is a huge part of the game of DBMM, and battles can be won or lost based on good terrain placement. So it's important to think carefully about how you're going to place your terrain during setup. There are as many tactical decisions that can be made here as there are in the game itself. In the pre-game setup sequence, players roll a dice and add their army's aggression factor, with the highest total being the invader. Terrain for both players are then selected from the defender's army list. Every army list has an abbreviated list of terrain available, and you can find the key to these abbreviations on page 2 of the army books or in the main rulebook. For example, in this list for the Gauls, the terrain selection from left to right reads a sea, rivers, difficult hills, scrubby hills, gentle hills, woods, orchards, marshes, boggy flats, fields, roads, and a built-up area with optional fortifications and boundary walls. The terrain types that are represented in bold and are underlined, in this case the woods, are compulsory for the defender. More on this later. As we discussed in the combat resolution video, terrain has different effects on different units and is broadly divided into 3 categories: good going, rough going, and difficult going. Units listed here in green fight normally in all types of terrain. Units listed in amber fight at -1 in difficult going, but can fight normally in rough. Units in red fight at -2 in difficult going and a -1 in rough going. Also remember that no units receive rear supports in difficult going. Units also move slower through rough and difficult going than they would in good going. Rough and difficult going slows troops only if they're entering or ending their move inside of the terrain. This is important because if you can get out of a piece of bad terrain, the unit can move at its full good going speed. Similarly, if a troop reaches the edge of a terrain piece that would slow them such that they would have no movement left, then they must stop at that edge. Difficult going has additional movement penalties that occur if the unit enters or ends their move inside the terrain piece, but not while exiting. While units in good and rough going may move normally as a group through the terrain, difficult going has additional movement penalties that occur if the unit enters or ends their movement inside the terrain piece, but not when exiting. While units in good and rough going may move normally as a group through the terrain, difficult going requires you to make separate group moves for each column of troops being sent into them, unless that group is made entirely of Siloi. This, combined with the fact that difficult going provides the slowest movement, means that it's very hard to maneuver an army through difficult going, and most armies would prefer to avoid or circumnavigate difficult terrain. Siloi's ability to move through difficult terrain as a wide group also makes them very important for holding these terrain types. Because of the difficulty of maneuvering most troop types through difficult going, you can thus use difficult going pieces to anchor a flank, or to disrupt an enemy battle line, or to funnel combat into a smaller frontage, as most armies are not going to want to send their main troops through difficult going. When thinking about what terrain pieces you want to select, always be comparative with your opponent's army. Just because rough and difficult terrain hinders your troops, doesn't mean you don't want to select it. If your opponent is going to be hindered more by the terrain than you are, for example if most of his troops are mounted and rely on their ability to maneuver and fight in good going, then you want as much rough and difficult going as possible, even if it's going to slightly disadvantage your troops. Also think about how terrain can shape the battlefield. If you're a small elite army facing a large enveloping force, then consider using terrain pieces such as a sea or waterway or rivers, or difficult features to shorten the width of the active combat area so your army cannot be easily outflanked or enveloped. The final note on terrain is about hills. Hills can either have a crest line, which determines the top of the hill, and thus whether an element is fighting up or downhill, or if a hill is larger than 600 paces in all directions, it may either have a crest or a flat top, with all units not on the flat top fighting either up or downhill. Being uphill of your opponent provides a +1 combat bonus to mounted in their phase, and to foot in the opponent's phase, making dislodging an uphill opponent very difficult. Gullies are like reverse hills, where figures in them are downhill of all of the figures on the ground level. So let's go ahead and see how the terrain placement phase plays out. Note these rules are for a standard 6x4 board, and even if playing using the larger 60mm base sizes, you should still use 40mm equals 80 paces for determining the size of terrain pieces. If playing on a smaller board or in smaller point games, check the variant rules for the specific terrain setup procedures. First, the player chooses the terrain pieces. Terrain pieces come in 3 different maximum sizes and cost an amount of feature equivalent points, or FE, depending on their size. These sizes can be half FE, where pieces are no bigger than 460 by 460 paces, 1 FE, where pieces are no bigger than 800 to 600 paces, and 2 FE where pieces can be no bigger than 1200 by 800 paces. Remembering here that 40mm equals 80 paces. All area terrain can be any of these sizes except orchards, olive groves and boggy flats, which must be the smallest half FE size. 1 FE sized gentle hills also have their price reduced to half FE. If you play DBMM regularly, you'll usually have a variety of terrain pieces in the various sizes to represent different terrain types. I use these printed pieces to represent various different types of terrain. Beside the usual area features, the first unpaved road a player selects costs 0 FE, and each following road costs half an FE. The first and second paved road costs 1 FE, and all other linear features or water features, further roads, frontier walls, etc. cost 2 FE. The defender gets to select 2 to 4 FE worth of terrain, and the attacker may select 0 to 2 FE worth of terrain. However, any of that 2 FE the attacker doesn't select, the defender may add to their placement amount. So in most cases, the attacker is going to want to select the maximum terrain possible so as not to forfeit this ability to the opponent. Defenders must select at least one feature of each compulsory type in their list. You may not select more than 1 2 FE sized piece of the same type. You may not select more than 2 of each non-compulsory type. And you may not select more than 3 half FE sized pieces of any type. As an invader doesn't necessarily need to invade along a sea or by a waterway, only the attacker can select these terrain types unless it's compulsory for the defender, and only one can be selected per game. Finally, a navigable river cannot be selected by the same person who is taking a difficult or craggy hill. Terrain is placed semi-randomly, but players will have some control over its placement. Before placement begins, board edges are numbered 1 to 4 by starting on the defender's left. The defender then nominates an edge as 5, and the attacker nominates an edge as 6. Once the player has selected the terrain and nominated the board edges, they place them down in the ordered list in this chart. If both players have selected terrain from the same tier, then the defender places theirs first. For most area features, you take 2 dice, one will determine the board edge, and the other will determine the distance requirements. Roll both simultaneously. Here the first dice determines that the piece must be closer to table edge 1 than any other table edge. The second dice is the minimum distance in base whips that piece must be away from all other terrain features, except in some limited circumstances where terrain can superimpose or come closer to each other. If it's the first terrain piece on that side of the board edge, then that number is also the maximum distance that piece can be away from the board edge. So in this example, the piece must be more than 3 base whips away from all other features, and because it's the first terrain piece on edge 1, it cannot be more than 3 base whips away from the edge. Often as the board starts to fill up, it becomes impossible to place terrain pieces based on the requirements and the piece becomes unplaceable. If this is the case, then the piece is just discarded. There are 4 types of terrain that break this general terrain placement rule. The first is roads and rivers. For roads and rivers, roll 2 dice. The piece stretches from one side of the battlefield to the other. If you roll the same board edge, the piece is discarded. If you roll a short and a long board edge, then the rivers must end 1200 paces away from the corner that is separating them, and multiple rivers on the same edge must merge together. The difficulty of crossing rivers depends on how wide they are and the weather effects. Rivers flow from the first edge to the second, so be sure to determine which dice represents that beforehand. Seas and waterways aren't rolled for and are just placed by the selecting player and can be placed on either board edge. They cover the entire board, and seas can extend 300 to 900 paces inwards, with half or less more than 600 paces away from the board edge. Up to half of the beach can be considered a rocky flat, while the rest is good going. Waterways similarly cover the whole edge, but are only 400 paces inwards. Lakes must be rolled for, and can occur on either short board edge, in which case they extend 300 to 600 paces inwards and must cover at least half the board. If a long board edge is rolled, they are discarded. Built-up areas are the final terrain piece that differs from the usual terrain rules. For build-up areas, I use cobblestone areas to designate the boundaries and place appropriate buildings on top depending on the scale and region. There are 2 options for placing a built-up area. Either a built-up area can be placed on top of a hill. This is nominated before the terrain deployment begins, and the hill is rolled for normally and the built-up area is placed on top. Alternatively, you can choose not to dice for the built-up area, and when it's time to place it, it can be placed either astride or in contact with a road, adjoining a board edge other than your enemies, or adjoining a lake, sea or waterway. If you select the built-up area, you may also select up to 0 to 2 roads for free, which are placed before you place the built-up area, increasing your ability to place the terrain feature in a tactically advantageous location. The final rule to note is that if a marsh or sand dune is placed, then any gullies are discarded. So that's the terrain placement rules. Roll for the board edge and the distance. The distance dice is the minimum distance any terrain piece must be from other terrain pieces, and if it's the first piece on that edge, then it's the maximum amount it can be away from the board edge. Rivers and roads stretch from one board edge to the other. Seas and waterways cover an entire short edge and are just placed by the selecting player. Lakes must be diced for and must land on a short edge. Built up areas may be placed on top of a hill, astride an adjoining road, adjoining a sea, lake or waterway, or any board edge not including your opponent's. The most important thing to think about when selecting terrain is what your opponent's likely army composition is, and will bad terrain disrupt his plan more than yours, or do you need the field to be open? Another thing to think about is how to protect your vulnerable flanks and stop envelopments, and selecting the right field of battle was always half the job of an ancient commander, and it's equally important in DBMM. Battles can be won or lost in terrain placement, so I hope this has given you a good introduction not only to the rules but how to think about placing your battlefield. If you found this video interesting and would like more DBMM content, or just to help get it shown to more people, please like, comment on the video and subscribe to the channel.